The ache was a permanent resident in Alara's chest, a tenant that had signed a lease for 2 years, 7 months, and what felt like a lifetime of days. It had its own rhythm, a dull throb that beat in time with her own heart, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her life. It was the price of admission for loving Lena. It was the cost of being her best friend, her confidant, her human diary, and the silent keeper of a love so profound it felt like it could crack her ribs from the inside out. Tonight, the ache was particularly sharp, a shard of glass twisting beneath her sternum. It was date night. Not for her, of course. For Lena and Mark. Alara was sitting on their shared sofa, a book open on her lap, its words a meaningless jumble of black ink. The apartment felt too quiet, hollowed out by Lena's absence. The air, usually thick with the scent of Lena's vanilla perfume and the faint, citrusy smell of her shampoo, was stagnant. Alara could trace the ghost of that scent if she tried, a phantom limb of sensation that only made the emptiness more acute. She had helped Lena get ready. It was a ritual of self-inflicted torture she could never seem to refuse. She had stood in the doorway of Lena's bedroom, leaning against the frame, trying to keep her breathing even as Lena pirouetted in a new dress, the fabric a swirl of deep emerald green that made her golden-flecked hazel eyes seem to glow. "What do you think?" Lena had asked, her voice a melody that Alara felt in her bones. "Is it too much?" Mark said we're going somewhere nice, but his idea of nice is a place that has cloth napkins. Alara had forced a smile, a careful construction of facial muscles that felt brittle, as if it might shatter. "You look beautiful, Lee." Honestly. He's going to forget how to speak. And Lena had beamed, a radiant, sun-drenched smile that lit up the room and simultaneously cast Alara deeper into shadow. That was the crux of it, the terrible, beautiful irony. Making Lena happy was the single most important thing in Alara's world, even when that happiness was a knife turning slowly in her own heart. She had become an expert at this particular brand of martyrdom, offering up pieces of herself to feed a flame she could never stand close to. She had zipped up the back of the dress, her fingers brushing against the impossible softness of Lena's skin. For a fraction of a second, she had allowed herself to imagine tracing the line of Lena's spine, of letting her hands rest on her waist, of pulling her close. The thought was a jolt of pure electricity, so potent it made her fingers tremble. She had pulled away quickly, her hands balling into fists at her sides, the phantom heat still burning on her fingertips. "Thanks, Elle," Lena had said, completely oblivious, turning to check her reflection. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Alara knew what she would do. She would do exactly what she was doing now with Mark. She would live her life, bright and beautiful and entirely separate from the secret, shadowed world Alara inhabited. The thought was a familiar bitterness on her tongue. The sound of a key in the lock jolted her from her reverie. She glanced at the clock. It was too early. They were supposed to be gone for hours. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. Date nights with Mark often ended one of two ways, with Lena returning giddy and apologetic for his latest minor offense, or returning in a storm of quiet, simmering anger. There was rarely a middle ground. The door opened and Lena stepped inside, alone. The emerald dress was slightly rumpled, and the light in her eyes had been extinguished. She closed the door with a soft click that echoed in the silence like a gunshot. She didn't look at Alara, just stood there for a moment, her shoulders slumped, her entire posture a portrait of defeat. Alara closed her book, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "Lee? What happened? Is everything okay?" Lena finally looked up, and the sight of her face made the air leave Alara's lungs. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears, and her mouth was a thin, tight line. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped one too many times. The carefully constructed charisma she wore like a second skin had crumbled away, leaving only raw, unguarded vulnerability. "We were at the restaurant," Lena began, her voice small and shaky. "And he was on his phone. The whole time. I asked him to put it away, just for a little while, and he laughed." She shook her head, a small, disbelieving motion. "He said I was being dramatic. That it was just a work thing." But it's always a work thing, Elle. Or a friend thing. Or a game thing. It's always something else. I'm always something else. Ilara was on her feet, crossing the space between them in 3 long strides. She reached out, her hands hovering in the air for a moment before she settled them gently on Lena's arms. The fabric of the dress was cool beneath her palms, but she could feel the trembling of the woman inside it. "I'm sorry," Ilara whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. They were pebbles thrown into an ocean of hurt. "It's not just tonight," Lena continued, the words spilling out of her now, a torrent held back by a dam that had finally burst. "It's everything. It's the way he never really listens. He hears the words, but he doesn't hear me. He doesn't see me. I feel like a ghost in my own relationship. Like I'm just playing a part. The supportive girlfriend. The pretty thing on his arm. And I'm so tired of the role." A single tear escaped, tracing a shimmering path down Lena's cheek. Ilara's thumb moved on its own accord, a reflex of pure instinct, brushing the tear away. The contact was electric, a spark that traveled up Ilara's arm and settled deep in her chest, right where the ache lived. Lena's skin was impossibly soft. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a heartbeat. That single, tiny movement was enough to make Ilara's world tilt on its axis. It was a surrender. A plea. It was everything she had ever wanted and everything she could not have. "He doesn't deserve you, Lena," Ilara said, her voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than sympathy. It was a fierce, protective anger that burned white-hot in her veins. Mark, with his casual dismissiveness and his careless hold on this precious, wonderful woman, had no idea what he was throwing away. Lena let out a shuddering breath and pulled away from Ilara's touch, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her splintering pieces together. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm screaming into a void. I keep trying to explain what I need, what's missing, and he just looks at me with this blank expression, like I'm speaking a different language." "What's missing?" Ilara thought, the words a silent echo in her own mind. "I am. The part of you that connects, that feels seen, that feels safe. That's what you find here with me." The arrogance of the thought shamed her, but the truth of it resonated with the certainty of a struck bell. She had spent years learning the language of Lena's silences, the subtle shifts in her moods, the flickering emotions in her eyes. She knew Lena better than she knew herself. "Maybe he just can't understand," Ilara offered, choosing her words with the care of someone disarming a bomb. "Maybe you're asking for something he's not capable of giving." Lena looked at her then, her gaze sharp and searching, as if seeing Ilara for the first time. "And what am I asking for?" Ilara's throat went dry. She swallowed, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. "Connection," she said softly. "Real connection. To be known. Not just looked at, but seen." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken things. Lena's eyes searched hers, and for a terrifying, exhilarating moment, Ilara felt as though Lena could see straight through her, past the carefully constructed walls of friendship and into the desperate, yearning heart of her. She felt exposed, stripped bare by that intense, questioning gaze. It was the stasis she lived in, this constant, agonizing dance on the knife edge of discovery. She was Lena's closest confidant, the one person who truly understood her, and yet that very closeness was the barrier that kept them apart. To confess her feelings would be to risk shattering this fragile ecosystem, to lose not only the hope of something more, but the certainty of what she already had. And so she remained silent, a willing prisoner in the beautiful, painful world of being Lena's best friend. The stasis held for another week, a fragile truce with the universe. Ilara moved through her days in a state of hyper-awareness, cataloging every glance, every touch, every shared laugh with the meticulousness of an archivist. Lena and Mark were in a Cold War, a state of tense civility that filled the apartment with a low-grade static. Lena spent more time in the common areas, seeking Ilara out, her presence a constant, warm weight in the room. They fell back into their old rhythms, making dinner together, watching terrible reality television, talking late into the night, but something had shifted. The foundation had cracked. Elara felt it in the way Lena's knee would press against hers on the sofa and stay there. She felt it in the way Lena's hugs lingered a second longer than they used to, a subtle shift from friendly to something more akin to seeking refuge. Elara was her safe harbor in the storm of her failing relationship, and the role was both a comfort and a curse. It allowed her a proximity she craved, but it was a closeness born of Lena's pain, not her desire. Or so Elara told herself, tamping down the treacherous sparks of hope that flickered in the dark. The breaking point, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, final implosion. Elara came home from her part-time job at the university library to find a cardboard box on the floor by the door. It was filled with Mark's things: a video game controller, a worn copy of a book she knew he'd never read, a faded hoodie. Lena was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by a sea of her own things, her phone lying face down beside her. She wasn't crying. Her face was unnervingly calm, her eyes distant, as if she were looking at something 1,000 miles away. "It's over," Lena said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He's coming for the rest of his stuff tomorrow." Elara's heart did a complicated, painful flip in her chest. It was a surge of pure, unadulterated relief, followed immediately by a wave of guilt so strong it made her feel sick. She should be sad for her friend. She should be offering condolences. But all she could feel was a wild, terrible hope taking root in the freshly tilled soil of her heart. She knelt on the floor in front of Lena, careful not to disturb the invisible barrier of her grief. "Are you okay?" Lena finally focused on her, her eyes looking hollowed out. "I don't know what I am." She picked up a framed photo from the floor. It was of her and Mark, taken at a wedding last summer. They were both smiling, but even in the photograph, Elara could see the strain around Lena's eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them. "I looked at this, and I tried to feel something. Sadness. Anger. Regret. Anything. And you know what I felt?" Elara shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. "Nothing," Lena whispered, the word hanging in the air like smoke. "Just empty. Like I was looking at two strangers. And then I felt guilty for feeling nothing. And then I just felt tired. So tired." She put the photo down, turning it face first against the carpet. "He said I was asking for too much. That I was impossible to please. Am I impossible?" "No," Elara said, the word fierce, immediate. "You're not impossible. You're just asking for love from someone who only knows how to perform it." Lena's gaze snapped to hers, and this time, there was a flicker of something in their depths. A dawning awareness. She stared at Elara, really stared, and the silence stretched, thin and taut. The apartment, which had felt so large and empty just moments before, suddenly seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until the only things that existed were the two of them, kneeling on the carpet, surrounded by the wreckage of a life Lena no longer wanted. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air between them. It felt like a sacred space, a moment suspended in time. Then Lena spoke, and her words shattered the fragile stillness, changing everything. "Can I ask you something stupid?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Anything," Elara breathed. Lena hesitated, biting her lower lip, a nervous habit Elara knew intimately. "Tonight, I don't want to be alone. My room feels, his room. It's full of his ghosts." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the wall. Can I stay with you? In your bed? Just to sleep. I can't be by myself." The request landed in Elara's chest like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. It was the catalyst. The shift. The world she knew, the carefully balanced ecosystem of their friendship, was fracturing. This was a line they had never crossed. They had shared the sofa for movie marathons, fallen asleep on each other's shoulders, but they had never shared a bed. It was a boundary, unspoken but absolute, that Elara had clung to for her own sanity. To have Lena, warm and breathing and real, beside her all night, it was a fantasy she had ruthlessly suppressed for years. It was a temptation so profound it bordered on terrifying. It was heaven and it was hell, woven together into a single, impossible request. Every rational part of her brain screamed no. It screamed that this was a bad idea, that it would break her, that she would lie awake all night, drowning in a proximity she couldn't act on. It screamed that Lena was vulnerable and grieving and that this meant nothing, nothing at all. But the part of her that loved Lena, the part that was her whole entire being, could only say one thing. Of course, Alara heard herself say, her voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Of course you can. The hours leading up to bedtime were a surreal blur. They ordered pizza they barely touched and watched a mindless comedy on television, the canned laughter filling the silences that had become cavernous and charged. Alara was acutely aware of every movement Lena made, the way she curled her feet up under her on the sofa, the way her hair fell across her face, the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing. It was as if all of Alara's senses had been turned up to their highest frequency, and Lena was the only station she could tune in. When the movie ended, an unspoken tension descended. It was time. Lena stood up, her movements slow and hesitant. "I'm just going to get changed," she said, her voice quiet. Alara nodded, unable to form words. She went to her own room, the space that was about to become a shared sanctuary, and her heart hammered against her ribs. She changed into an old, oversized t-shirt and a pair of soft cotton shorts, her hands shaking slightly. She pulled back the covers of her double bed, smoothing the duvet with a precision that felt absurd. The room smelled of lavender laundry detergent and old books. Soon, it would smell of Lena too. The thought was both intoxicating and terrifying. She heard the soft padding of Lena's footsteps in the hall, and then she appeared in the doorway. She was wearing one of Alara's old band shirts, one Alara had given her years ago because she liked the faded logo. It hung loosely on her frame, the collar dipping low to reveal the delicate curve of her collarbone. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, and she looked younger, more vulnerable than Alara had ever seen her. "Is this okay?" Lena asked, gesturing to the shirt, her voice small. "It's always looked better on you anyway," Alara managed, trying for a lightness she didn't feel. Lena offered a weak smile and walked to the bed, hesitating for a moment before climbing in on the side nearest the wall. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her body a small, tight knot under the duvet. Alara's bed, which had always felt spacious, suddenly seemed impossibly small. Alara took a deep breath and walked around to the other side, her feet cold on the wooden floor. She slid under the covers, her movements stiff and awkward. She lay on her back, staring up at the ceiling, her body rigid, every muscle tensed. The space between them was a chasm, a no-man's land crackling with unspoken energy. She could feel the heat radiating from Lena's body, could smell the faint, clean scent of her soap. It was overwhelming. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the city outside and the frantic, silent drumming of Alara's own heart. She wondered if Lena could hear it. It felt loud enough to shake the bed frame. Then Lena's voice, soft as a sigh in the darkness. "Elle? Yeah." Alara's voice was a croak. "Thank you," she whispered. "For this. For everything." "Always," Alara replied, the single word carrying the weight of 2 years, 7 months, and all the days she had loved her. Another silence fell. Alara thought Lena might have fallen asleep, but then she felt a tentative movement beside her. Lena shifted, rolling onto her side to face her. Alara remained on her back, her eyes wide open in the dark, her body frozen. She could feel Lena's breath, warm against her shoulder. It was a sweet, agonizing torture. "Can I ask you another stupid question?" Lena's voice was even quieter now, laced with a vulnerability that made Alara's heart ache. "There are no stupid questions," Alara whispered to the ceiling. There was a long pause, so long that Alara thought she might have changed her mind. Then Lena spoke, her words dropping into the darkness like stones into a still pond. "Have you ever been in love?" The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. It was a direct hit, a sniper's bullet to the heart of Alara's most protected secret. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs seized, her throat closed up. Of all the questions in the world, it had to be that one. Here. Now. With Lena's warm body just inches from hers, with the scent of her filling Alara's senses, with the entire universe seeming to hold its breath. I mean, really in love, Lena continued, her voice soft and searching, oblivious to the hurricane she had just unleashed inside Alara. Not the kind you think you're supposed to be in. Not the kind that looks good in pictures. But the kind that feels like breathing. The kind that makes you feel seen, down to the very bones of you. The kind you were talking about earlier. Alara's mind raced, searching for an answer, any answer that wasn't the truth. The truth was a confession, a declaration, a potential detonation of everything she held dear. She could lie. She could say no. She could invent a vague, long-ago college romance. But lying to Lena, especially now, when she was so raw and open, felt like a betrayal. She took a shaky breath, the air burning in her lungs. She turned her head on the pillow, just enough to see Lena's silhouette in the dim light filtering through the window. She could just make out the gleam of her eyes, fixed on her. Yes, Alara whispered, the word a tiny, fragile thing in the vastness of the night. I have. She felt more than saw Lena's small nod in the darkness. What does it feel like? And Alara, with the object of her every secret, unspoken feeling lying beside her, had no choice but to describe it. It feels, she started, her voice thick with unshed emotion, it feels like coming home. Like for your whole life you've been speaking a language no one else understands, and then you meet one person and they get it. Without you having to translate. It's terrifying. Because it's a vulnerability you've never known. But it's also the safest you've ever felt. She was talking about Lena. Every word was about Lena. Every syllable was a love letter addressed to the woman lying beside her, a woman who would never know she was the recipient. The irony was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting pang in her gut. She had to stop. She had to shut this down before she said too much, before she gave everything away. But Lena wasn't finished. Did they know? She asked, her voice barely audible. Did you ever tell them? Alara closed her eyes, a single, hot tear escaping and tracing a path into her hair. The dam was breaking. No, she whispered, the confession tasting like ash in her mouth. I never told them. Why not? The question was so simple, so innocent. So devastating. Because I was afraid, Alara screamed in the silence of her own mind. Because I was afraid of losing you. Because you were my best friend, and you were with someone else, and telling you felt like an act of destruction. Because I would rather have this broken piece of you, than risk having nothing at all. I was afraid, she said aloud, the two words a ghost of the truth. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then Alara felt it. A soft, tentative touch. Lena's fingers, light as a moth's wing, brushed against her arm, just above the elbow. The contact was a brand, a searing point of heat that seemed to burn straight through to her soul. It wasn't an accidental brush. It was deliberate. It was a question. And then Lena rolled closer. The space between them vanished. Her body was a warm, solid line against Alara's. Her thigh pressed against Alara's, her hip against her hip. The soft cotton of their shirts was the only thing separating them. Alara's breath hitched. She could feel the gentle rise and fall of Lena's chest with every breath she took. The scent of her, vanilla and citrus and something uniquely, indefinably Lena, was all-encompassing. This was the line. They were crossing it. And Alara was completely, utterly paralyzed by a terrifying, exhilarating mixture of hope and dread. The days that followed were a study in exquisite torture. Lena did not move back to her own room. The first night bled into a second, and then a third, until it became an unspoken routine. Lena would retreat to her room to change, and then appear in Alara's doorway in one of Alara's old t-shirts, her expression a mixture of apology and something else, something Alara couldn't quite decipher. Something that looked dangerously like longing. They never spoke of it. They never addressed the new geography of their lives, the fact that Alara's double bed had become their shared space. During the day, they orbited each other with a strange, new gravity. The casual touches that had started before the breakup now escalated, becoming more frequent, more deliberate. Lena's hand would find Alara's as they watched a movie, her fingers lacing through Alara's with a sense of rightness that stole Alara's breath. She would lean her head on Alara's shoulder while they sat on the couch, her hair tickling Alara's cheek, the weight of her comforting, agonizing pressure. Alara felt like she was living in a dream, a beautiful, fragile thing that could be shattered by a single wrong move. She was terrified of waking up. She existed in a state of suspended animation, every nerve ending alive and buzzing. Her entire world had shrunk to the space of their apartment, to the inches between her body and Lena's. The late-night conversations continued, becoming the centerpiece of their new reality. Propped up on pillows, with only the soft glow of a bedside lamp pushing back the darkness, they talked for hours. But the tenor of the conversations had changed. Lena was no longer just mourning the end of her relationship with Mark. She was dissecting the very concept of her relationships, of her life, with a relentless, searching curiosity. "Do you ever feel like you're just performing?" Lena asked one night, her voice a low murmur in the quiet room. She was tracing idle patterns on the back of Alara's hand, her fingertip a spark of heat against Alara's skin. Alara was trying to focus on the words, but the simple, repetitive motion of Lena's touch was short-circuiting her brain. "Performing how?" Alara managed, her voice huskier than she intended. "Like playing a role," Lena clarified, her gaze distant. "The daughter. The student. The girlfriend. I spent so many years with Mark trying to be the person I thought he wanted. The easygoing girlfriend who likes sports and doesn't get too emotional. And it was exhausting. It was like wearing a costume that was 2 sizes too small." "I couldn't breathe properly," she paused, her fingers stilling on Alara's hand. She turned her head on the pillow to look at Alara, her hazel eyes serious in the dim light. "I never feel like that with you." The words were a direct hit. Alara's heart clenched. "What do you feel like with me?" she whispered, unable to stop herself from asking. Lena's expression softened, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "Like me. Just me. The version of me that doesn't have to translate my own thoughts. The version that can be messy and confused, and it's okay." Her thumb stroked gently over Alara's knuckles. "It's like you said. It feels safe." Safe. The word echoed in the space between them. For Alara, this proximity was the most dangerous, precarious place she had ever been. For Lena, it was a sanctuary. The dichotomy was a constant, thrumming ache in Alara's chest. Another night, they were talking about the future, about what Lena wanted to do now that she was untethered from Mark and the life she had thought she was building. "It's weird," Lena said, staring up at the ceiling. "For years, my future was this clearly defined picture. Marriage to Mark, a house in the suburbs, 2.5 kids. The whole thing. And the thought of it didn't exactly thrill me, but it felt inevitable. Like the track my life was supposed to be on. Now, it's just a blank page. And it's terrifying, but it's also exciting." She rolled onto her side, propping her head up on her hand to face Alara. "What about you, Elle? What does your blank page look like?" Alara's mind went blank. Her future had been a vague, hazy landscape for years, with one single, sharply focused figure at its center, Lena. Every dream, every hope, was tangled up with her. She had no picture of a future that didn't include Lena in some capacity. "I don't know," she said, which was the truest thing she could say. "I guess I've never been very good at long-term planning." Lena's gaze was intense, searching. Alara saw it then, a flicker in Lena's eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible drop of her gaze to Alara's lips. It was there for only a second, a split second, but in Alara's hyper-aware state, it felt like an eternity. The world seemed to slow down, the air growing thick and heavy. Alara's lips tingled, her breath catching in her throat. Then, as quickly as it had happened, the moment was gone. Lena blinked and looked back into Alara's eyes, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. She cleared her throat and lay back down, facing the ceiling again, a new, palpable tension in the air. Something had just happened. A line had been drawn and then smudged. Ilara's heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Was she imagining it? Was she projecting her own desperate longing onto innocent gestures? Or was something real and tangible and terrifyingly new growing in the space between them? The ambiguity was maddening. Ilara felt like she was losing her mind, constantly analyzing every word, every touch, searching for meaning, for confirmation. The hope was a fragile, tender thing, and she was terrified of crushing it with the weight of her own expectations. But it was also becoming impossible to ignore. Lena was changing. The way she looked at Ilara was different now. It was softer, more vulnerable, and filled with a silent, questioning wonder. One afternoon, Ilara came home to find Lena in the kitchen, a cookbook open on the counter, surrounded by flour and bowls. She was trying to bake bread, a task she had never once shown an interest in. Her hair was pulled up in a messy bun, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked so beautifully, wonderfully domestic that it made Ilara's heart ache. "Don't say a word," Lena said without looking up, her brow furrowed in concentration as she kneaded a sticky mass of dough. "I saw it on a show. It's supposed to be therapeutic." Ilara leaned against the doorframe, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "How's the therapy going?" "It's mostly making me angry," Lena grumbled, pushing a stray strand of hair out of her face with the back of her wrist, leaving another streak of flour. She finally looked up and saw Ilara smiling. Her own expression softened. "You have that look on your face." "What look?" "The I find you endlessly amusing look," Lena said, her lips twitching into a smile of her own. "You're laughing at me." "I'm not laughing," Ilara said, walking closer. "I'm admiring your tenacity." She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the flour from Lena's cheek. Her thumb lingered for a moment, tracing the curve of Lena's cheekbone. The gesture was intimate, familiar, something a lover would do. And Lena didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, just as she had done that first night after the breakup. The air between them crackled. The mundane kitchen scene was suddenly charged with an almost unbearable intensity. Ilara could feel Lena's warm breath on her hand. She could see the faint pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. The desire to lean in, to close the remaining distance between them, was a physical force, a magnet pulling her forward. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned, her heart hammering. "You missed a spot," she mumbled, her voice strained. Lena's eyes opened, and they were dark, clouded with an unreadable emotion. The playful mood had evaporated, replaced by something raw and serious. She stared at Ilara, her lips slightly parted, and for the second time, her gaze dropped to Ilara's mouth, lingering there for a beat longer than the first time. This time, Ilara knew she wasn't imagining it. The tension was a living thing in the apartment now, a third roommate that sat with them on the sofa and lay between them in bed. The unspoken was growing louder every day, a roaring silence that threatened to deafen them both. Ilara felt herself starting to pull back, a subconscious act of self-preservation. The hope was becoming too big, too bright. It was starting to hurt. If this was all in her head, if Lena was simply leaning on her in a moment of post-breakup confusion, the fall back to reality would shatter her completely. So she began to create distance. Just a sliver. She would go to bed a little earlier, feigning exhaustion. She would find reasons to be out of the apartment, spending longer hours at the library, burying herself in research she didn't need to do. She kept her hands to herself, resisting the urge to return Lena's casual touches. It was a retreat, a strategic withdrawal from a battlefield that was becoming too dangerous for her heart. It took less than a week for Lena to notice. Ilara was in the kitchen, making tea, her back to the living room. She had been home for an hour, and she and Lena had exchanged only a handful of words. The silence felt strained, unnatural after weeks of constant conversation. "You've been avoiding me." Lena's voice, coming from directly behind her, made Ilara jump, sloshing hot water onto the counter. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Lena was standing there, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression a mixture of hurt and determination. She had cornered her. There was no escape. "I haven't," Ilara lied, her voice weak. She turned back to the counter, busying herself with wiping up the spilled water, unable to meet Lena's gaze. "Don't," Lena said, her voice sharp. "Don't lie to me, Elle." "Not you." She took a step closer, her voice dropping, becoming softer, more pleading. "For the last 3 weeks, you've been my anchor. And now you feel a million miles away. You're hiding from me. I want to know why." This was it. The point of no return. The confrontation she had been dreading and, on some deep, masochistic level, craving. The subtext was about to become text. Ilara kept her back to her, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "I'm not hiding. I've just been busy." Tired, the excuses sounded feeble even to her own ears. "Bullshit," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, Ilara turned to face her. The hurt in Lena's eyes was a physical blow. It was the last thing in the world she had ever wanted to cause. "What aren't you telling me?" Lena asked, her gaze unwavering, pinning Ilara in place. "What changed? Was it something I did? Something I said?" Ilara's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. She could see the cracks forming, feel the emotions she had suppressed for so long beginning to seep through. She shook her head, a helpless, jerky motion. "It's not you," she whispered. "It's me." "Then talk to me," Lena pleaded, taking another step closer. They were barely a foot apart now. Ilara could see the tiny golden flecks in her hazel eyes, the faint, worried line between her brows. "We talk about everything. Why is this different?" "Whatever it is, you can tell me. You know you can." The irony was crushing. The one thing she couldn't talk to Lena about was Lena herself. Lena seemed to sense her internal struggle. Her expression softened further, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know something shifted between us after Mark left. I know it. And I know it's my fault. I leaned on you, I took over your space, your bed. I've been so confused." She paused, taking a shaky breath, and her next words made Ilara's world stop turning. "I've been confused about everything," Lena continued, her eyes searching Ilara's, her vulnerability a raw, open wound. "About what I want. About who I am. After Mark, I thought I would be devastated, but mostly I just felt relieved. And the only thing that has felt real, the only thing that has felt right in all this mess, is you." Ilara's breath hitched. This was happening. This was real. Being with you, talking with you, lying next to you at night. Lena's voice cracked on the last words, and a faint blush crept up her neck. "It doesn't feel like friendship, Elle. Not anymore. It feels like something else. Something more. And it scares me." She took a final, decisive step, closing the remaining space between them. Her hand came up, not to touch, but to hover in the air near Ilara's cheek, a gesture of profound hesitation. "I think," Lena started, her voice trembling, "I think I might not be as straight as I've spent my whole life believing I was. Because I've been thinking things I've never thought before." Her eyes, wide and luminous, held Ilara's captive. "I've been thinking about kissing you." The confession hung in the air, a perfect, terrifying, beautiful thing. It was the key turning in a lock Ilara had long thought was rusted shut. It was the pre-confession, the words that stopped just short of a full declaration, but they were enough. They were everything. Ilara felt the tears she had been holding back for years finally well up in her eyes. The ache in her chest, the constant companion of her love for Lena, was transforming, shifting from a dull, persistent pain into an overwhelming, soaring feeling of hope so intense it felt like it might break her open. She was no longer retreating. She was no longer hiding. The time for fear was over. Lena's words, "I've been thinking about kissing you," echoed in the silent kitchen, dismantling every defense Ilara had ever built. They were a battering ram to the fortress around her heart, and all at once, the walls came crashing down. The years of silence, of carefully chosen words, of swallowed confessions, it all became unbearable. The truth was a living thing, a pressure building in her chest that had to be released or it would suffocate her. Tears streamed freely down Ilara's face now, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a relief so profound it felt like grief. It was the mourning of a lonely past, the shedding of a skin she had lived in for far too long. Lena's face crumpled in alarm at the sight of her tears. The bravado of her confession vanished, replaced by a wave of panic. "Oh, God, Elle, I'm sorry," she stammered, her hand dropping back to her side. "I've ruined everything. I knew it. I've misread everything. I've made you uncomfortable. I shouldn't have said that." "No," Alara choked out, the single word cutting through Lena's frantic apologies. She shook her head, swiping at her wet cheeks with the back of her hand. "No, you haven't ruined anything." She took a deep, shuddering breath, gathering the courage she had been stockpiling for 2 years, 7 months, and an eternity of days. This was the moment. There would not be another. "You think you've been thinking about kissing me?" Alara's voice was watery but steady. A hysterical little laugh bubbled up in her throat. "Lena, I've thought about little else for the last 31 months. The confession landed. The world seemed to stop spinning. Lena froze, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous understanding. The confusion on her face slowly melted away, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock, and then by something else. A light. A brilliant, stunning recognition that illuminated her from the inside out. 31. Lena whispered, the word barely audible. "You mean, all this time? With Mark, with everything, you?" Alara nodded, fresh tears blurring her vision. "I have been so in love with you," she confessed, the words finally spoken aloud. They felt both impossibly heavy and miraculously light. "For so long. And I was so afraid of losing you, of losing our friendship, that I buried it. I thought I was burying it, but it was always there, right under the surface." She looked at Lena, her heart a raw, open thing, completely exposed. "That's why I pulled away. Not because of you, but because of me. Because having you so close, sleeping in my bed, it was becoming impossible to hide. The hope was, it was too much." Lena stared at her, her expression one of absolute wonder. It was as if Alara had just handed her the missing piece to a puzzle she had been trying to solve her entire life. Every late-night conversation, every shared silence, every lingering touch, it all clicked into place, recontextualized in the brilliant, blinding light of Alara's confession. "Oh," Lena breathed, a soft, wondrous exhalation. She took a step forward, her hands coming up to frame Alara's face, her thumbs gently wiping away the tears. Her touch was no longer hesitant. It was sure. It was certain. "Oh, Alara." She had never used her full name before. It was always Elle. The sound of it, spoken with such reverence, such awe, sent a shiver down Alara's spine. All this time, Lena whispered, more to herself than to Alara, her eyes searching Alara's as if trying to see the past 2 years in them. "I was so unhappy, and I couldn't figure out why. I thought it was me. I thought I was broken, impossible to please, just like he said. But it wasn't me." Her voice grew stronger, filled with a new, breathtaking clarity. "It was him. It was all of them. Because they weren't you." And there it was. The mutual confession. The final, beautiful, terrifying piece falling into place. The space between them was electric, humming with years of unspoken feelings, with the dizzying potential of a future that had, just moments ago, seemed impossible. The air was thick with it, a tangible thing that made it hard to breathe. Lena's gaze, which had been locked on Alara's eyes, now dropped, slowly, deliberately, to her lips. There was no mistaking it this time. It was a clear, unmistakable signal of intent. Her own lips parted slightly. "Can I?" she whispered, her voice husky, the question a plea for permission, a final, respectful check-in before crossing the ultimate threshold. Alara couldn't speak. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement that conveyed all the wanting, all the yearning, all the years of waiting. "Yes." Lena leaned in, closing the last fraction of an inch between them. The first brush of her lips against Alara's was impossibly soft, tentative, a question in itself. It was featherlight, a ghost of a touch, filled with all the fear and wonder of this new, unexplored territory. For a single, suspended heartbeat, that was all it was. a gentle testing of the waters. But then Alara responded. She leaned into the kiss, a silent answer, a surrender. And it was all the encouragement Lena needed. The kiss deepened. The initial hesitation melted away, replaced by a certainty that was staggering. Lena's hand slid from Alara's cheek to the back of her neck, her fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her closer, tilting her head to get a better angle. Alara's hands, which had been hanging uselessly at her sides, came up to grip Lena's waist, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning wildly out of control. It was not a gentle kiss anymore. It was a kiss of discovery, of reclamation, of years of pent-up emotion finally unleashed. It was urgent and hungry and desperate, but underneath it all, there was a tenderness, a reverence that made Alara's knees feel weak. It was the taste of vanilla and salt from their tears and something that was just Lena. It was the feeling of coming home. It was everything she had ever imagined, and yet it was so much more. It was real. It was tangible. It was Lena's soft lips moving against hers, Lena's warm breath mingling with her own, Lena's body pressed so tightly against hers that Alara couldn't tell where she ended and Lena began. They broke apart, not by choice, but by the desperate, burning need for air. They rested their foreheads together, their chests rising and falling in unison, their breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Alara kept her eyes closed, trying to commit every single sensation to memory. The feeling of Lena's fingers in her hair, the warmth of her body, the lingering taste of her on Alara's lips. "Oh," Lena breathed out, the word a soft puff of air against Alara's skin. "Wow." Alara let out a shaky laugh, opening her eyes. Lena's were still closed, a small, serene smile on her face. She looked peaceful. More at peace than Alara had ever seen her. "Yeah," Alara whispered, her voice hoarse. "Wow." Lena's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Alara, her hazel eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but this time, they were tears of joy. "That felt," she started, trailing off as if she couldn't find a word big enough. "Right," Alara finished for her, the word a simple, profound truth. "So right," Lena agreed, her smile widening. "How did it feel so right?" Nothing has ever felt like that." She pulled back slightly, just enough to look at Alara properly, her hands still cradling Alara's face. "I am so sorry," she said, her expression turning serious. "For how long you had to hold on to that by yourself? For all the times I complained about him to you? That must have been torture." "It was worth it," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. "To get here. It was worth every second." The aftermath of the kiss was a strange and wonderful territory. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a quiet, trembling vulnerability. They were still standing in the kitchen, foreheads pressed together, the scent of tea and tears and new beginnings hanging in the air. The world outside the small bubble of their embrace had ceased to exist. But reality, with all its sharp edges and complications, was waiting. "I'm terrified," Lena whispered, her voice a small thread of sound against Alara's skin. The confession was a stark contrast to the euphoria of the past few minutes. Alara pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, her hands still resting on Lena's waist. She saw her own fear reflected in Lena's gaze. "Me too," she admitted, the words a relief to say out loud. "I'm utterly, completely terrified." A small, shaky smile touched Lena's lips. "Good. As long as we're on the same page," she took a deep breath, her expression growing more serious. "What does this mean, Elle? What do we do now?" It was the question Alara had been too afraid to even form in her own mind. For years, the fantasy had ended with the kiss, the confession. She had never dared to imagine what came after. The after was a blank map, an unknown country. "I don't know," Alara said honestly. "I guess we figure it out. Together." The word "together" felt solid, a foundation upon which they could start to build. Lena nodded slowly, her eyes searching Alara's. "I feel like I've been asleep for years, and I've just woken up. And everything looks different." "Everything feels different," she shook her head, a look of wonder on her face. "All those conversations we had about what was missing with Mark. About what real connection felt like. I know, Alara said softly. No, you don't, Lena insisted, her grip on Alara's face tightening slightly, demanding her full attention. I was describing you. Every single time, I was describing you, and I was too blind to see it. I was measuring every relationship I've ever had against what I had with you, and they all came up short. I just didn't understand what it meant. I thought this, she gestured between the two of them, was what female friendship was supposed to be. I didn't realize I was in love with my best friend. The validation in those words was a balm on a wound Alara hadn't even realized was still bleeding. All the times she had felt invisible, all the times she had felt like a supporting character in Lena's life, Lena had seen her. She had seen her all along, even if she hadn't known what she was looking at. There's still Mark stuff, Lena said, her gaze flickering towards the box by the door. He's coming tomorrow. The mention of his name was like a cold draft in the warm, safe space they had created. Alara's heart sank a little. The ex-boyfriend. The obstacle. We'll deal with it, she said, her voice more confident than she felt. You don't have to do it alone. I know, Lena said, her expression softening. That's new, she let out a long sigh, and some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. Okay, one day at a time. One day at a time, Alara agreed. Lena leaned in and kissed her again, and this time there was no desperation, no frantic discovery. It was soft and slow and deeply reassuring. It was a promise. It was the start of their first day. They didn't talk much more that night. The emotional weight of the evening had left them both exhausted, their hearts and minds reeling. They moved in a sort of dazed, gentle silence, cleaning up the kitchen, their hands brushing, their bodies moving in a new, shared rhythm. When they finally retreated to Alara's bedroom, it felt different. It was no longer a space of agonizing proximity and unspoken tension. It was their space. As Lena slid into bed, she didn't retreat to the far side. She turned immediately onto her side to face Alara, her hand finding Alara's under the covers, their fingers lacing together. Alara lay on her side, facing her, their knees touching. In the soft lamplight, she studied the face she had loved for so long. She traced the curve of Lena's brow, the slope of her nose, the softness of her lips. It was the same face, but everything had changed. The barrier between them, the invisible wall of friendship and fear, had dissolved. "Good night, Alara," Lena whispered, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Good night, Lena," Alara whispered back, squeezing her hand. For the first time in 2 years, 7 months, and countless nights, Alara fell asleep instantly, her heart quiet and full, the ache in her chest finally, blessedly gone. 3 months later, the world had settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. The autumn chill had given way to the crisp bite of early winter, and the apartment, which had once been a stage for Alara's silent pining, was now unequivocally their home. The ghost of Mark had been exorcised on a single, awkward Saturday morning, an exchange of cardboard boxes and stilted pleasantries that Alara and Lena had faced as a united front. Lena had been calm and resolute, and Alara had stood just inside the doorway, a silent, solid presence at her back. The moment the door had closed on him for the last time, Lena had turned, wrapped her arms around Alara's neck, and buried her face in her shoulder, not in sadness, but in a profound and final relief. Now life was made up of small, perfect moments that felt both novel and deeply familiar. It was waking up to the warmth of Lena's body curled against hers, her arm thrown carelessly over Alara's waist. It was the scent of coffee brewing, a sound and smell Alara now associated with Lena's soft, sleep-warm kisses. It was the easy, unspoken intimacy of sharing a space not as roommates, but as partners. Alara was sitting on the sofa, a book once again open on her lap. But this time, she was actually reading it. The late morning sun streamed through the window, catching the gold in Lena's hair as she moved around the living room, watering their small collection of houseplants. She was humming a tuneless, happy little song, her bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. The quiet domesticity of it all still, on occasion, took Alara's breath away. She would be struck by these moments of profound gratitude, a feeling so overwhelming it felt like her heart might overflow. She had spent so long yearning for a life she never thought she could have, and now she was living it, breathing it, tasting it in the coffee Lena had just made for her. Lena finished with the last plant and turned, her eyes landing on Alara. A slow, easy smile spread across her face, the kind of smile Alara had once thought was reserved for other people. Now it was hers. "What are you looking at?" Lena asked, her voice soft. "You," Alara answered simply, closing her book and setting it aside. "I'm just looking at you." Lena walked over to the sofa and perched on the armrest beside Alara. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from Alara's forehead. Her touch, which had once been a jolt of illicit electricity, was now a familiar, comforting warmth. It was still electric, but it was the steady, life-giving current of a home, not the volatile strike of lightning. "Is that a good thing?" Lena teased, her thumb stroking Alara's temple. "It's the best thing," Alara said, her voice completely earnest. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. The simple, grounding contact was a constant reminder that this was real. "I was thinking," Lena said, her voice taking on a more thoughtful tone, "about that first night. After I left Mark. When I asked to sleep in your bed." Alara opened her eyes. "I remember. I was so lost," Lena continued, her gaze distant for a moment as she remembered. "I felt like my whole world had fallen apart. But the truth is, my world wasn't falling apart. It was falling into place. I just had to walk through the wreckage to find my way here." She looked back at Alara, her eyes shining. "I was running away from him, but I was also running to you. I just didn't have the language for it yet." "You found it," Alara whispered, her heart swelling. "You gave it to me," Lena corrected her gently. "You showed me what it was supposed to feel like. Safety. Connection. Love. I just had to be brave enough to see it." She leaned down, her lips brushing against Alara's in a soft, tender kiss. "And I'm so glad I was." Alara wrapped her arms around Lena's neck, pulling her down from the armrest and into her lap. Lena laughed, a bright, musical sound that filled the sun-drenched room, settling herself comfortably against Alara's chest. Alara held her close, burying her face in Lena's soft, vanilla-scented hair, breathing her in. The ache was gone. In its place was a profound sense of peace, of rightness. The quiet suffering had been replaced by a quiet joy. The fear of losing the friendship had transformed into the certainty of a shared life. She was no longer a ghost in her own story, but the main character in a love story more beautiful than any she had ever dared to imagine. She had crossed a terrifying line that night, a geographical shift in her emotional landscape that had changed everything. But on the other side, she hadn't found destruction. She had found her home. Lena shifted in her lap, tilting her head back to look up at her. "I love you," she said, the words as easy and natural as breathing. "I love you," Alara replied, her voice thick with an emotion that would never get old. She leaned down and kissed her again, a long, slow, lazy morning kiss that spoke of shared futures and quiet contentment. She understood, in that sunlit, perfect moment, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are not the ones that begin with a lightning strike, but the ones that smolder quietly for years, a steady, hidden warmth that, once given air, can burn brighter and truer than any fleeting flame. She was finally, completely, and exactly where she was supposed to be.